What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today is kind of an odd video, because today I'm going to demonstrate to you how delusional Neal the Gnostic informant is. He seems to have created his own reality, where his own idealized version of events have occurred. Listening to his recent interview with Tom Jump had me face desking so many times. Also, he's being a tad bit homophobic in this interview, so trigger warning for that. If y'all want to fuck around and find out how crazy Neal's version of reality is, then please stay tuned.
Captain Dadpool sent me your video, the one where you debunk Carrier on the for like 3 hours or whatever. Really long.
Oh,
video.
yeah.
Oh, you mean this guy?
I have to ask. We started out this with you thinking that mythicists just sort of dismiss things, and I'm wondering if through our conversation, do you feel like I've just dismissed anything without reason?
I don't know if without reason is the best word. It's more like you have to cling to more fringe ideas in order to make them work.
The guy who had no good reason to dismiss my position other than how popular it was? That's the type of individual supporting Neal's videos. Okay. Well, the interview that Neal did with Carrier was embarrassing for Neal. And this interview that Neal is doing right now is proving how delusional he is, because he seems to be living in a completely different reality.
Well, the reason why I started that video was I noticed that Richard Carrier and this is actually, people might think this is a dumb reason, but this is just the honest truth of it. I was watching a video that Carrier and Godless Engineer did, and it was supposedly like dunking on this other academic named David Litwa, who's a decent academic in my opinion. He's a good friend of mine too. And they were just, and they were like, it was like they were putting the microscope on every word he said. If he like said something half wrong, and he's in a live stream setting in a very like laid back setting. It's not like a peer reviewed debate or anything. Like this is not like, so he's just hanging out with somebody on a live stream for a couple hours. So of course you're going to say things that are going to be like, oh, check the book on that. Check the book on that. So they did like a 4-hour video supposedly dunking on this guy. And it was like, to my personal opinion, it was embarrassing.
First of all, as you can see, it wasn't a 4-hour stream. It was a normal 2-hour stream where I was responding to someone who was wrong on the internet. And the fact that he has gotten so upset to where months later he's still bitching about somebody criticizing his friend is really sad. And what makes it worse is that he's upset about something that never fucking happened.
How hard is it to say Lit was wrong about this? Here's what I think he's wrong. Instead of saying he shouldn't have a PhD, he's lying right now.
I never said he shouldn't have a PhD. Also, I
think
never
you did question his PhD.
No,
sure you did.
I never have done this. No.
In fact, the Godless Engineer video?
I'm not in the Godless Engineer video.
The one that the one about Litwa and that you guys were talking about with when he was the video he did with History Valley. You guys were saying people like this should not have PhDs.
I don't
is
remember
just
saying
completely
that,
wrong. Okay,
I remember saying the opposite, saying that I actually like a lot of Litwa's work and I think it's really solid.
This entire situation was started by an event that never happened. Also, we were justifiably criticizing a scholar speaking on a topic that he supposedly specializes in. And what's more, we're not the only ones that have noticed this.
Okay, so first off, when Litwa tries citing the first chapters of the Ascension of Isaiah against Carrier, he is acting like everyone agrees that this was not an add-on. This wasn't a later edition. But Norelli himself says this is a later addition to the Ascension of Isaiah. The first 5 chapters were not composed by the same person who did chapters 6 through 11. And he says that in black and white, in Italian.
Pretty sure Litwa was saying that this was done in 3 parts. He might not have said it in that video.
No, he said, he cited chapter 3 to argue why chapter 11 Pocket Gospel was original. and also proof that the text is about that. He's saying that there wasn't any interpolations and that's just arbitrary to say so.
But even if you decide that you don't like chapter 11 as data, okay, you just want to kick it out of the book of the Ascension of Isaiah, you can go and to an earlier section of the book, okay, which is back in chapter 3, and you can have again a section on the birth, mentioning the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion. Okay, so it's not as if you were to get rid of chapter 11, that all of a sudden the Ascension of Isaiah would just be about, Jesus descending into the region of the moon and being crucified in the sky by sky demons. Okay,
But I don't think he says that, though.
That was exactly what he says.
Are you sure? I don't think he
Yeah,
said
that's. I wouldn't be making this big of a deal about it unless that's what he said and why he cited chapter 3.
I think it's pretty clear. The pocket gospel is added on later. I think it's pretty clear.
Well, no, that's exactly what Litwa argues against. He says that was part of the original as well as chapters 1 through 5. But here's the thing. He might have mentioned the book, but guess what he said? He said there weren't these interpolations to the text. He denies it. If Litwood had actually read the 3 pages of Norelli that he actually cited in his book, he would have seen that that's not true, because in the Norelli volume, he is basically trying to argue that the pocket gospel is original to the text, not in a later edition. And the person he's arguing with to make this case is R.H. Charles, who is writing about the Ascension of Isaiah and the manuscripts traditions as he knew it in the year 1900. And R.H. Charles is not a mythicist.
I'm going to have Litwa back on to go over all this and to clear it all up.
When it comes down to it, Litwa was directly addressing something that Carrier extensively researched for his book. Litwa got basic things wrong, and we should hold scholars to a higher standard than non-experts. If Litwa is going to sit there and claim that scholars like Carrier just simply haven't read the existing scholarship on the Ascension of Isaiah, when Carrier literally mentions the existing scholarship on the historicity of Jesus, then he better at least know the basic shit of what the scholarship says.
It looked like people who were mad because, backstory, M. David Litwa has written some things about Carrier and is very critical about Carrier's scholarship. And so Carrier obviously doesn't like him. And Godless Engineer, anyone who Carrier doesn't like, Godless Engineer doesn't like. It's just, that's just the way it is.
Honestly, I don't know or care who Carrier doesn't like. I wouldn't even say I dislike Litwa necessarily. I don't even know him. What I do know is that I don't like it when people misrepresent the scholarship. And Carrier, he just disregards the absurd claims about him, which in Litwa's case is basically that Carrier had some kind of demonic vision or experience that has fueled his anti-Christian bias and coming to his conclusion that Jesus didn't exist. In Carrier's article about Litwa, he pretty much sticks to the arguments and claims that Litwa makes in his book and shows how they are wrong.
So they did this video, and I just was watching it, and I was like, do they actually think this is convincing? And I just remember being like, all right, I want to do a video showing like some of the dumb shit they say, because if they think this is like the deadliest sin ever, of like some of the stuff that M. David Litwa was saying, like, which wasn't even that big of a deal, they think that's bad. Why don't we put a light on what they're saying?
This motherfucker can't even read aloud from a book. I say that because in order to accomplish what he claims, all you gotta do is read Carrier's book, and he doesn't do that. And if you want proof of that fact, you can go and look at my Neal and Philo video, and you'll see here in a minute that Neal can't even steelman one of Carrier's arguments. Also, we never said nor acted like Litwa committed some kind of deadly sin. What we said was that he was wrong about a few things, and then we proceeded to give people good information on those topics. Neal has to make us look like religious fanatics because that fits his narrative. It's really sad because all it shows is that he doesn't have any legitimate criticisms of us. He has to make shit up, and that's fucking pathetic. problematic.
Godless Engineer in one of his videos said that Philo of Alexandria believed in an angel named Jesus before Christianity. And spoiler alert, that's not true. It's nowhere to be found. We have books of Philo that are preserved till today. He doesn't say shit about an angel named Jesus. He talks about a logos. Okay, we can go there. We can talk about that. There's a lot of similarities. Obviously, Christians are drawing from Philo. Everyone knows that. It's not like some only mythicists know that. No. Everyone knows that. Everyone agrees on that. But there's no Jesus in there.
And this is the real reason why Neal has latched on to this Philo topic. I mentioned Philo's angel, and admittedly, it was poorly worded. But it was poorly worded because it was meant to be an attention grabber. Obviously, it grabbed the wrong motherfucker's attention, though. Here's the section of my video that pissed Neal off. First, I want to introduce you to Philo of Alexandria. He is a 1st century Jew that was writing before Jesus supposedly pimp-walked around Judea. He is important to the mythicist position because he is a prime example of a Jew that believed in a pre-existent celestial being named Jesus, who was the firstborn son of God, the celestial image of God, God's agent of creation, and God's celestial high priest. These are all things that describe Jesus in the New Testament. Literally, there is a Bible verse in the New Testament that matches each of these claims made by Philo. Philo was born around 10 to 20 BCE and died prior to 50 CE. Philo wrote a doctrine on the Logos of Judaism between 10 and 35 CE. This was a description of the very Savior that is central to Christianity. In On the Confusion of Tongues, number 63, Philo says, "For the Father of the universe has caused him to spring up as the eldest son, whom, in another passage, he calls the firstborn. And he who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father, has formed such and such species, looking to his archetypal patterns." In this passage, Philo identifies this eldest son as the firstborn, and who imitates the ways of his father, and identifies him as an agent of creation by saying that he forms such and such species. His idea of the Logos stems from his understanding of the Jewish theology surrounding this Messiah figure. This firstborn son idea is noted in Psalms 89:27. Several verses identify this Messiah as both God and man. The servant or agent of creation can actually be found in several verses, including Zechariah 3:8 and Zechariah 6:12 through 13, which actually labels him as both priest and king. Zechariah 6:11 through 12 even directly uses the name Jesus for the Messiah. Philo is a perfect example of a Jew who was looking to the scriptures for a Messiah figure. And the Jesus character that we ended up with is precisely the one described by Jewish theology, which leads me to my next point, scriptures. In retrospect, I shouldn't have tried to craft something that was meant to grab your attention. What I should have done is more accurately represented Philo's Logos. What Neal doesn't tell you is that I listed the sources of my information, and I even directly mentioned that in my video that if you want to know more, you should read those. But still, I should have structured my video better, because I can see how somebody would view that video and not come away with an accurate depiction of Philo's archangel. But instead of addressing and correcting me, Neal is attacking Carrier as if he said what I did. That's like hearing someone trash talk you and then slapping the shit out of his friend.
And so him and Carrier try to argue that there is, if you look at this one verse in Zechariah that Philo quotes in this one passage in this one paragraph here, and they go on this huge tirade about that. So
notice how Neal describes this argument, because he does have some pieces of the argument in there, but he obscures the finer points with his childish blah blah blahs. He should know what the argument is because Carrier has literally stepped him through it.
Before I get into this, I'm just going to summarize really quickly. So like my argument is, my position is that Philo is referring to Zechariah 6:12 here. And the person he's talking about, he thinks, is the person in this verse who's named Jesus. Now, I make an argument for that. I don't say that it's just the case. I make an argument for it, and we can get into that later. But that's what I'm saying. And so what he does do, though, this is indisputable, is that he says that there's something in there called the East, Anatole in Greek. There's someone in that passage called that, who he identifies as the firstborn son of God, and he gives a bunch of attributes of this great being. You could find many other passages.
Let's not forget, he says that it's a companion of Moses who utters the speech.
Yeah, but he often uses that phrase to refer to the prophets.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean anything from my point. But even Young agrees it's verse 6:12 of Zechariah that.
Young actually has Numbers 23:7 in the next passage.
I hope.
And I think that context matters. I think this is part of the same topic.
You're going to take that back in 5 minutes.
Okay, we'll see. I don't think so.
Okay, so here it is, 62. I'm just going to read it through. I have also heard of one of the companions of Moses having uttered such a speech as this: "Behold, a man whose name is the East," which is a direct quote from Zechariah 6, verse 12 of the Septuagint. A very novel appellation indeed, if you consider it as spoken of a man who is compounded of body and soul. But if you look upon it as applied to that incorporeal being who in no respect differs from the divine image, you will then agree that the name of the East has been given to him with great felicity. For the Father of the universe has caused him to spring up as the eldest son, whom in another passage he calls the firstborn. And he who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father, has formed such and such species looking to his archetypal patterns. Next sentence. But an example of the worst kind of dawning is afforded by the words used by the man who is willing to curse the people who are blessed by God. Numbers 23:7. For he also is represented as dwelling in the East, and this dawning, have the same name as the former one, has nevertheless an opposite nature to it, and is continually at war with it.
Sure.
Do you follow the problem here?
No, I get that. I'm not saying that that's who he's talking about, but I'm saying he's connecting this prophecy with what Balaam says in Numbers.
He's saying the opposite of that. Do you understand? No, literally, Philo's saying the opposite. He's saying that the Anatole in Numbers is an evil being at war with the other being that he was just talking about.
Right, but I never said that this evil being is who he's speaking about. I'm saying Numbers is where the original Numbers is where the original context of this East thing comes from, that Zechariah himself is even speaking on.
It was a very rambly.
Zechariah is referring back to Numbers.
Mistranslated the last name, the family name of Joshua in this passage, Yehezedek, and he broke it up into son of Jehovah the righteous to make it seem like this is like a son of God thing. He also doesn't tell you that the real meaning of this passage is about two crowns, a silver crown going to Joshua and a gold crown going to Zerubbabel. And here's the kicker, because after this it says, from his place below, he shall build the house of the Lord and receive power and sit and rule upon the throne. That's Zerubbabel who's going to rule and govern. Joshua is supposed to anoint the king. That's the entire purpose of this ceremony. This is a coronation ceremony where the high priest, who has the silver crown, anoints the king, who in this case is the Davidic line, from the east. Now, where am I getting this from? Why am I just making this up to try to rebuke Carrier? No, Philo tells you this because one paragraph later, he gives you the context. He tells you about Balaam's prophecy, which I just showed you was about the mountain in the east. All the context is there, but what Carrier does is he takes the context away and then he hones in on mistranslations and then fools you.
It sounded like you were arguing that Philo was referring to the Numbers passage, when Philo actually makes the opposite argument of you, where he's saying Philo thinks that the Anatole in Numbers is an evil being, not the being he's talking about. Now, I'm just talking about what Philo thinks, right? It's just talking about what Philo thinks.
But Philo's acknowledging that Zechariah's passage
but
about the man
he's saying
from
these
the
are
east.
two different people. You do acknowledge
Sure,
that,
no,
right?
I know that. I get that.
So the Anatole in Zechariah 6, for Philo's point of view, is not the Anatole in Numbers 23. You agree with that?
I do agree with that.
Okay.
I never said that it was.
You kind of
But what I
implied
said
it,
in my video, what I said in my video is the original context of where all this comes from.
But why does that matter to what Philo thinks? Explain that argument.
Well, the reason why it matters is because Philo's talking about an angel who doesn't have a name at all. It's an incorporeal being with many names. It's not just specific to Zechariah.
That's a self-contradiction. You can't have an angel with no names and have many names.
No. What I'm saying is he doesn't actually name it. It's an angel with many names who's never named. That's what I mean by that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that therefore one has to make an argument that the person he's referring to is the one named Jesus in that passage. Totally agree that you have to make an argument for that. That's not a given.
Sure. But there's also other passages where because he does talk about, and I'll grant this to you.
I don't understand why you brought up Numbers 23, because that contradicts Philo. Philo is saying that the Numbers passage is referring to a different being. So it can't inform the other passage. Do you understand? Like Philo thinks that someone else, so it has nothing to do with what Philo's talking about.
But that's not what I'm saying, though. What I'm saying is what Philo's acknowledging here, when he's looking at Zechariah, is the origin of this passage actually goes back to Numbers, and he's distinguishing the two.
No, he doesn't say that. He says the opposite of that. Literally,
no, I didn't say that. I didn't say that he said it's the same being. I didn't say that he said it's the same being.
Then I don't understand your argument. What are you arguing? It doesn't apply to anything I've said.
That Balaam's prophecy of a star coming out of the east is coming from Numbers.
Sure.
Zechariah is playing on that, and then Philo's reading it and doing his own analogy or analysis of it.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that someone else thinks something, and you're ignoring the whole question of what Philo thinks, because
we don't know what Philo thinks. We just know what Philo wrote.
No, that's what I mean. We can infer what writers think from what they write. That's the whole function of language. But
it's not clear that this angel's name is Jesus. Though.
I'll grant you it's not clear. I think it is, but that doesn't matter. My point is, you can't refer to Numbers 23 as something that he's talking about in passage 62 and 63. He explicitly denies this. He explicitly says that passage Numbers is talking about a different person, that the word east is the name of two different beings.
Right. No, I've never denied that. I've never said it was the same being.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just charitably say that you just said it really badly in your video. So
if you go back to what I said in the video that the context of this passage in Zechariah,
it's funny. I think you did the same thing that I did in the video, that clip you brought up.
Sure, whatever. If maybe I said it wrong,
I said the sentence wrong and made it sound like I was saying that Philo said a thing, because you definitely give the impression that Philo means the anatole in Numbers 23, that somehow that informs his understanding of what's going on in 62. It doesn't at all. It gives us no information at all about.
I think Philo understands where Zechariah is getting it from. That was my point.
Even if he does, he still thinks that they're two different beings.
Sure, no, I agree with that.
So I don't know the information.
I don't think I've ever said they were the same being.
I don't. If you admit that they're different beings, I don't understand your argument.
Well,
this is why it's so unhinged. It doesn't make any sense.
Let me explain that. That's a good question. The reason for me bringing that up is because if we just look at 62 and just clip it out and put it next to on a verse from On Dreams and put that next to another verse from a different book, well, then we can make an argument based off that. But what's the methodology? What's the context of what Philo's actually getting at? He's talking about something bigger. Like he's not just talking about this one little verse. He's talking about a bunch of shit.
I don't follow how that relates to anything I've said. I don't understand your argument.
Sure, and I actually think that Philo's angel and logos is the angel that's talking to the prophets, not the high priest himself, named Jesus.
Yeah,
in Zechariah, there's an angel talking to Zechariah. Zechariah then relates the stuff to Zerubbabel and Jesus. That's the angel that he's talking about, I think.
Well, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. You can make an argument for that, but
that was my whole thing. I said that in my video too.
That did not come across.
I'll show you. That is very important that you missed that part. I said that in my video.
In the context of what Philo's also saying, when he talks about in the next paragraph, the prophecy from Balaam about the mountain in the east, Zerubbabel's called the mountain. He is from the Davidic line. He is the governor. He is the one building the temple. But there is two crowns, and the high priest does anoint the king. So it's actually kind of in the middle. There's two anointed ones, the high priest and the king.
That still doesn't explain numbers. Like, I don't see how that gets you numbers. What does numbers have to do
with
with
the whole point of me bringing up numbers was to show you that Philo is acknowledging where all of this stuff comes from in Zechariah.
But it's not. If they're two different beings, they can't be referring to the same thing. So how is that an argument? That's what I don't understand what your argument is.
Well, because it's very Platonic, because you have different, like, and that's not.
I don't understand. I really don't. I literally don't. You've made no sense to me in this video or in your video.
The number wasn't really that much of part of my argument.
I mean,
against yours.
I mean, it's a weird. It was really weird. I'm just saying it's really weird, and I'm still even here. It's really weird. I literally don't understand what you're arguing, or even what you're arguing against. I have no idea what you're talking about. I understand when you say sentences. I understand what those sentences mean, but I don't understand what you're supposed to infer from them, like what they even have anything to do with my art.
But Philo's acknowledging that the verse in Zechariah originates from this verse in Numbers. That was my point.
No, he's not. He's saying it can't possibly, because it's referring to two different beings, so they cannot be referencing each other. Cannot. It's literally impossible. That's what Philo is saying. He's saying they're two different beings.
I'm not saying that it's the same being.
So I don't understand why referring to Numbers 23 helps us at all.
I don't even know why you're still. That's not even.
Because it doesn't make any sense. Your argument.
That wasn't even the crux of my argument, though. Numbers had nothing to do with what I was saying after that. That was all I was doing. All I was pointing out.
I'm asking you to explain the argument about
Numbers. I just did. All I was pointing out to you.
You just said you didn't, and now you just said you did.
Then listen to what I'm saying. Then listen to what I'm saying.
Try it again. Include the word numbers in your sentence. The more that is being said either supports or doesn't contradict anything I've said. So that's why I don't understand why you brought it up. I don't understand. I still don't know what your argument is. Literally, it makes no sense. I've struggled.
I don't know what else to tell you. I've explained it to you already.
I think we're at a loggerheads. I don't think there's just. You can't come up with a way to frame it in English that makes any sense to me. I don't know what your argument is. Let's go back to what my argument is then. Let's compare arguments. If everybody at home hopefully understood your argument, and I'm just.
But if you go back to Numbers.
What Philo says in 62 and 63 is that in that case, unlike Numbers, in the Zechariah case, it's talking about the firstborn son of God, which is this thing that we know from other passages that Philo identifies as the celestial high priest. So here's my argument, and you never respond to my argument, so it shows that you don't know what my argument is. But anyway, here's my argument, is that Philo thinks, he clearly thinks here, that whoever's called East in Zechariah 6 is the Son of God and the high priest, the celestial high priest. We know that for a fact. Philo thinks, he says it's the same angel. Right.
Yeah, but he doesn't say that no, that's not what he says though.
Well, okay. So he says he's the son of God. It's right there. It's literally right there in verse 63 of Philo.
Yeah. He also says, "Behold, the man whose name is the East."
And he says that East refers to the firstborn son of God, the incorporeal being who in no respect differs from the divine image. Yeah.
Okay.
You acknowledge that. I just want to make sure you.
No, we're on the same page now. Okay.
Now,
how do you get to that?
Starting to go insane there. All right.
How do you get to that being Jesus?
I'm getting there. All right. So I'm shocked you don't know the answer to this.
No, anyway, I know it. I want you to say it though.
So okay. All right. Oh no, that makes sense. Okay. If that's what you mean, then yeah, absolutely. I totally advocate that kind of discourse. All right. Anyway, so he thinks whoever in this passage is called the East, he thinks, and the reason he thinks they're called the East in this passage is because he thinks the person who's called the East is the firstborn son of God and the celestial high priest, because that's who this being is. We know from Philo's writings.
Where else are you getting this from?
Other passages, which you even cite in your video, where he identifies, he makes clear that this firstborn son of God, the same angel, is also the celestial high priest. So do you acknowledge that in other passages?
In other passages, but what kind of methodology are we doing when we're just pulling out passages from Philo from different topics in different books?
They're not different. When Philo talks about the same angel in different places, so it's just like Paul talks about Jesus in different places and doesn't list all of Jesus' attributes in every place, but you can assemble all the attributes.
But he also mentions that this high priest Eleazar is he's basically like the image of God. Why don't we say the angel's name is Eleazar then?
Because here he's talking about an incorporeal being who is called the firstborn son of God, and Philo elsewhere says that being, specifically that being, is the high priest of the celestial temple.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Do you understand that? So, like,
I understand that.
In 62 and 63,
I've said that in my video too.
He cannot mean an earthly priest. Philo cannot mean.
So it can't be Jesus.
I think Zechariah did. I think
so.
Zechariah
it can't be Jesus then, who's an earthly priest.
Well, This is I'm
All
talking
right,
about Philo.
finish your thought.
We're not talking about Christians. We're talking about Philo. All we want to establish is what does
I'm
Philo,
talking about Philo. I am talking about Philo.
Right. Yeah, but this Philo doesn't know anything about Jesus, so Jesus Christ. So that's not. Let's not get into Christian belief. It's just
I didn't
Philo.
say that. I didn't say that.
Kind of did, but anyway.
No, I didn't. I'm talking about Philo.
You
about
referenced
Philo.
Christian belief, but all right. So forget it. Doesn't matter.
No, I didn't. I said you can't say that the angel's name is Jesus because he's talking about a celestial high priest, and then in one verse he references Zechariah. So therefore, let's look through Zechariah and find who the high priest is. That's just weird methodology.
No, it's not. Like so if give me an analogy. So in two different places, Paul says Jesus is the creator of the universe. He says that in 1 Corinthians 8. Like, do you acknowledge that? Like,
sure.
He says, yeah. And then in a completely different passage, in a completely different book, he says Jesus is the seed of David. So, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it valid procedure to say that Paul believes that Jesus is both the creator of the universe and the seed of David, right? Is that a valid method? Have I done something correct?
Sure.
This is exactly what I'm doing with Philo. Do you follow? Philo repeatedly
Philo's written more than the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's not relevant. Philo, no, but you have to remember also that Philo being the idea that he thinks this is the creator of the universe. So the idea that someone built the temple of God, you see the thinking here, how Philo could easily think that this is Jesus, the Son of God, the high priest that is being talked about as the East. That's how he's reading the verse. We can totally say he's wrong. He's totally wrong. No way Zechariah meant that. It's not what Zechariah wrote.
I get the argument.
But,
I'm fine with it.
Right. So,
I'm not sold by it, though, but I get what you're saying.
So there are very specific reasons to use the Philo references. And the way that Carrier connects Philo to the name Jesus is literally just how you use references. There's no reason for Neal to be describing the argument like he does unless he simply still does not even understand the basic argument. And it's not that the argument is even hard to understand. A fucking elementary school child could follow the logic on this argument.
I made a video about it, and I focused mainly on that thing because that's like the big mythicist argument. The big mythicist argument is not that Jesus didn't exist. It's that there was an angelic Jesus that predates Christianity. Most people don't realize that. Most people are like, why are you what is your battle against mythicists? There's hardly any evidence that Jesus existed. I'm like, no, I don't disagree with that. The fact is that's not what mythicism is. Mythicism is that there was an angel named Jesus before Christianity, which is false. It's completely fringe. So that was my video.
Ironically, Neal directly asked Carrier how Philo's angel factors into his conclusion for mythicism.
Let's assume that, for the sake of argument, let's assume that you're right. Philo thought it was Jesus. Never says it though. Never makes any message of it.
Yeah, he just cites the verse.
How do you use this again to prove mythicism against Christianity? Are you saying that?
I literally don't. So
then what?
This is in my section on background knowledge. I make very clear at the beginning of that section, which is actually in chapter 4, which begins the 2 chapters, I should say, on background knowledge, and there are 48 numbered elements. And in the beginning, I explain that the background knowledge does not tell the difference to us between whether Jesus existed or not, because every single 48 item thing in there is compatible with a historical Jesus, right? So even if you agreed with me that Philo's talking about a Jesus who had all these angelic properties, that is in no way an argument for historists or for mythicism, because Christians could just simply believe that Jesus was their Jesus was an incarnation of this Jesus, right?
Exactly.
In fact, they could totally have renamed him Jesus for this purpose. Like we don't have to assume that Jesus was his given name. He might have been walking around being called Emmanuel or whatever. Like his actual name could have been anything. Or he might have said, I'm going to call myself the Jesus now so that it lines up. And I actually make an argument for this.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
There's literally no reason for him to think that the entire mythicist case is built on Philo's angel. The only reason that I can surmise as to why Neal is stuck on Philo being integral to the mythicist position is my poorly worded video instead of Carrier's actual argument in the academically peer-reviewed book that he wrote. In my video, I said that Philo's angel was one of many things that has convinced me of the minimal mythicist position. But Carrier also cleared this up directly with Neal in the interview video.
Yeah, absolutely. If someone's doing that, if they're just name picking scholars who support them.
You see that a lot in the amateur world, you know?
Yeah, if that is the sum of your argument. Now, I would be careful, because I do suspect maybe you might be over-interpreting people. So like, in the case of John, for instance, when he mentions the Philo thing is one of the things that convinced him, that was literally one of the things. Like, he has a list of things. Right. So it's important to understand it's the stack, not the single thing. Sure. And so the same thing, like if someone says this scholar agrees with me, make sure you're checking if that's just part of a stack of arguments and not the argument, right? Because certainly if someone says, well, this scholar says this, then you should agree with them.
Because a Christian can just...
So Neal should know all of this already because he heard directly from Carrier reasonable explanations. I sincerely don't know why Neal is representing things in the fashion that he does.
To help people understand why most historians reject this, you have to really understand what the criterion they're using to establish that someone does exist or doesn't exist, and why the mythicism is going further than what is required by adding these extra criterion to try to really make the burden of proof for convincing that a person exists historically significantly higher than it should be. And that's the part that I'm trying to grasp.
I'd actually love to hear the historicist's answer to this question. In true Gnostic informant fashion, Neal can't answer this question either, because he doesn't know. Carrier actually wrote an entire book on this topic. It's called Proving History, and in it, he goes into the various historical methods you can use in order to prove things in history. But more importantly, he also analyzes all of the criteria used by New Testament and biblical scholars in order to prove that Jesus existed in history, or things that Jesus supposedly really said in history, or things that he really did in history. In New Testament and biblical studies, you have varying methodologies and criteria for how to prove certain things in history. What Carrier's book, Proving History, does is kind of recenters the entire discussion and takes it in a more ancient history kind of way of doing the historical method. He covers, arguing from evidence as well as arguing for the best explanation. And he tells you the benefits of both and how you kind of need both in order to make a coherent argument. Carrier is trying to reorient biblical and New Testament studies to use a better methodology that's superior to the various methodologies that are currently being used by New Testament and biblical scholarship. This is something that's been noticed in the scholarly community. There's various authors out there that have published peer-reviewed works on the problems in biblical studies and their methods. So this is Carrier's attempt to readjust that into a more ancient historical setting. The problem with Jumpman's question is that mythicism only applies the basic historical method that's already being employed by other areas of historical research. One common misunderstanding is that mythicists somehow make up criteria that makes it impossible for Jesus to exist. But that's not what we do, because we don't create new criteria. We just apply the historical method to the evidence that we already have. And the problem with the criteria used by historicists is that it's nearly identical to the criteria and methodology used for the resurrection. The fact is that the evidence we have for other historical figures is so much better than the evidence we have for Jesus. The evidence for Jesus existing is so bad that New Testament and biblical scholars have to create new criteria and new methodology in order to prove that he existed.
If you are going to debate Carrier on mythicism, the thing that he just doesn't have an answer for, because there's no evidence of, is this pre-existing.
We have already seen Carrier painstakingly step Neal through his argument. Neal seems to not even understand that Philo mentions various aspects of this Logos archangel figure across multiple volumes and sections. This is something that even Dr. Bart Ehrman acknowledges in How Jesus Became God. The only thing that Ehrman doesn't acknowledge is the name Jesus, which Carrier has a sound and convincing argument for. So just to summarize this, the main person that is usually used by historicists as the gold standard in this topic disagrees with Neal, yet Neal still obstinately claims that Carrier has no answer for it. This all just seems completely divorced from reality.
So after that video came out, Carrier wrote a blog, and obviously he, was very unhappy with the video and had some things to say. Well, Derek's kind of a peacemaker, Derek Lambert of Myth Vision, and he suggested that me and Carrier should get together and do a live and talk it over, and let's duke this out and be fair and honest, and let's see who's right about what, but let's be polite and get to the bottom of some of this stuff. I'm like, all right, deal. So we went live, and he's calling me. He's saying that I'm insane. Like, he's like really like the gaslighting was through the roof, and I knew it the whole time, but I just kind of let it happen with whatever. I'm not gonna like let him get under my skin while I'm live. Like, I'm just like, okay, whatever.
Wait, Carrier was the one gaslighting? Because the only one that I remember misrepresenting what was actually said was Neal.
Although I didn't see Godless Engineer's video, I did see a draft of the script for it, and I'm pretty sure he's spot on in most of that. So I don't know
Which
if you
video are you talking about?
Video. The one where he goes into the Philo stuff. He might have gone into other things too, but
no, I think that was a complete flop, in my opinion. You said that GE's video was all right. I'm interested to hear how you spin this.
Okay, so this is interesting. That what you just did right now is actually interesting. I've seen you do this several times, and you've done it a few times in this video, and you did it before. You did it in your video when you showed a clip of me talking about Philo.
Yeah.
And then you talked about it. You have this tendency to change the meaning of what people say. I actually very clearly didn't say, I think everything in Godless's video is correct. I said most everything or something similar like that. I made a qualified, and this is the thing, is I'm very careful usually with my choice of words.
Sure.
Not always, I screw up sometimes, but usually I'm very careful. So I don't say everything. I said like most of the stuff in there is pretty spot on. Might be some stuff that's not.
How hard is it to say Lit was wrong about this? Here's what I think he's wrong. Instead of saying he shouldn't have a PhD, he's lying right now.
I never said he shouldn't have a PhD. Also, I
think
never
you did question his PhD.
No,
sure you did.
I never have done this. No.
In fact, the Godless Engineer video?
I'm not in the Godless Engineer video.
The one about Litwa and that you guys were talking about with when he was the video he did with History Valley. You guys were saying people like this should not have PhDs.
I don't
is
remember
just
saying
completely
that,
wrong. Okay,
I remember saying the opposite, saying that I actually like a lot of Litwa's work and I think it's really solid.
I'm pretty sure Litwa was saying that this was done in 3 parts. He might not have said it in that video.
No, he said, he cited chapter 3 to argue why chapter 11 Pocket Gospel was original, and also proof that the text is about that. He's saying that there wasn't any interpolations and that's just arbitrary to say so.
But even if you decide that you don't like chapter 11 as data, okay, you just want to kick it out of the book of the Ascension of Isaiah, you can go and to an earlier section of the book, okay, which is back in chapter 3, and you can have again a section on the birth, mentioning the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion. Okay,
I don't think he says that though.
That was exactly what he says.
Are you sure? I don't think.
That's. I wouldn't be making this big of a deal about it unless that's what he said and why he cited chapter 3.
So it kind of seems like Neal is the only one that's gaslighting here.
Anyways, he made this point where he said that I misquoted his ideas on Philo. He's like, I didn't say any of that stuff. I made it clear that Philo doesn't actually mention this angel, but we can pull from Philo and find that he might have thought this. Okay, that sounds way different. Let me go back to the videos, because he goes in front of these atheist conventions, but he used to until he got kicked out. He used to go in front of these atheist conventions and speak as if he's like an authority on this stuff, and he would just spew nonsense in front of.
This has been explained to Neal time and time again. These lectures or speeches are only giving an overview to the argument. and not really diving in deep to the evidence for it. If people are interested in the full argument, they can go and read about it in his book.
But there's an easy way to check, is to say when a scholar is giving a speech, which is just like a brief of something that they published under peer review, and you think they said something weird, you're like, well, that can't be right. The responsible thing to do is go check the book and say, well, what does he say in the book? Like what was he summarizing? Rather than to say like, oh, well, he's a word slip. Now he's committed to saying something that he never meant to say, and we're going to just condemn him for it. I don't buy that as a proper response. Now, the weird thing though is that you've done this multiple times. You've done it twice in this video. You've done it in that video, where you very easily switch from someone is saying one thing to now someone is saying a much more extreme thing than they actually said. Like you're missing the nuances in their speech. And since you've done that multiple times, I'm going to caution you that maybe you want to look into this and pay more closer attention to it, that this might be getting you into a lot of arguments.
Instead of consulting the actual argument, Neal continuously harps on these lectures or speeches. The only reason I can rationalize as to why Neal would forego the actual academic material for these speeches and lectures is because they are easier to twist towards his narrative. And we have evidence of this through his disingenuous edits of these lectures and speeches.
I think he knew that his audience was like this. It's the same dynamic of like a pastor in front of a church. Like most of these atheists just want to hear that Jesus doesn't exist. No offense to atheists, but like a lot of them just want to hear that stuff. So he knows he has that over his audience. So he's just completely abusing the sources, the text, the data, and just going on. And so
here we have Neal espousing information that he simply cannot know. That information being that Carrier is just giving his audience what they want, and that they only want to hear that Jesus didn't exist. Then he goes on to suggest that Carrier is abusing the source material. That you would need evidence for. And the only evidence that he can muster is misrepresenting Carrier's arguments, like we have seen all throughout this video.
I go back to these videos. I'm like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he did say it better. I could be wrong. Let's look back. And it turns out not only in that video that we were discussing did he actually say exactly what I thought he said. He did that in 7 other videos, including an 8th video that I found where he says that it is scholarly consensus, an undeniable fact. I'm quoting him verbatim. He said it's an undeniable fact that there was a Christian cult before Christianity that worshiped a Jesus angel. He tells us in front of millions of people. Well, that video got like 1 million views, maybe 500,000 views. Someone, let's just say a lot of views in front of this convention.
Well, that's not what he said.
Now, what's the alternative explanation? Let's suppose Jesus didn't exist. How then do we explain Christianity? There are some unusual yet indisputable facts that we can first cue you in on. One is that some pre-Christian Jews had already identified a character in the Old Testament named Jesus as a supreme archangel and God's firstborn son.
Notice the lack of the phrase scholarly consensus and the use of indisputable rather than undeniable. Although one could argue that indisputable and undeniable are basically the same thing, they can be used to convey different messages. Of course, apologists and theologians could deny that these are facts, but you couldn't coherently dispute them. This is a hole that Neal has dug himself in when he claims that he is citing verbatim what Carrier has said. Words matter, especially when you say that you're speaking verbatim. Now, I could see Neal as criticizing me for putting him under the microscope, but what he said is factually false, and he's actively trying to give someone advice to use. So it seems like he's actively misinforming people on the topic. Should misinformation of any kind be tolerated? Should we just allow Neal to spout these untrue things without being corrected? I don't think so.
So I pull these clips out and I make a little collage for Facebook. I didn't even put it on YouTube. Made a short video for Facebook. Put that up there. Then he said that I took him out of context there. So then obviously his boyfriend, Godless Engineer, had to make a video and try to splice it up in a way where it try to make me look like I was like just barely cutting out certain things. But the stuff that he showed that I was cutting out was like Philo grew up in Israel, and it was like outside information that had nothing to do with what Carrier was trying to say that I was taking out of context. And I was just like, I can't believe that this is mind blowing that people actually that they think this is commit. So anyways, I made a second video responding to that.
Seems like Neal's letting a little bit of homophobia slip out there. Using homosexuality as a derision towards anybody seems quite homophobic to me. If he's not trying to be homophobic here, then maybe he should, 1, apologize, and then 2, refrain in the future from using homosexuality as a derision towards another person. But to focus on the abuse of reality here, let's take a look at some of these edits to see if I've only added superficial contextual information that has no effect on Carrier's argument. And that's the key there. They have to have no effect on the argument that Carrier is making.
Philo of Alexandria, he wrote in the 20s to 40s AD, so roughly shortly before Paul, shortly before Christianity, or coterminous with it. He was a Jewish theologian, in fact, one of the most respected of his era.
Well, shit, he's got me there. Wait, hold on. I seem to remember that there's something after this. Is there something after this?
He attests in his writings that, and I cite all of the passages in my book on the historicity of Jesus, he attests that in fact there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. He actually finds the character named Jesus in Zechariah 6, and he says that this being actually is a celestial being, not a man in history, unlike the verse as it was originally intended. So he tells us this, that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being named Jesus.
In a celestial being named Jesus.
Celestial being named Jesus?
Who was, and he says, these are all the attributes of this pre-Christian Jesus in outer space. He was the firstborn son of God. He was the celestial image of God. He was God's agent of creation. In other words, God just gave him marching orders and Jesus did the actual creating. And he was God's celestial high priest.
Carrier goes on to explain to the audience that the name Jesus is found in Zechariah 6:12, and that Philo connects this figure in Zechariah 6:12 to his Logos archangel. Neal calls this...
It was like outside information that had nothing to do with what Carrier was trying to say that I was taking out of context.
But I feel like Carrier explicitly saying that Philo connects his idea to the name Jesus using Zechariah 6:12 as the argument that Carrier's making. If you'll go back, you'll notice that Neal cuts out from the very beginning of that slide to all the way at the end where Carrier's making his conclusion. This removes all context from Carrier's conclusion and just makes it seem like Carrier is claiming that Philo calls this archangel Jesus without providing any reasons. As we can see, that's not what happened. Carrier also makes sure to specify that all of his sources and citations are in OHJ. It's very obvious that Carrier was giving a brief overview of this one argument, and Neal does this for nearly every video that he's talking about.
Now, another important clue comes from Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish theologian who wrote between the 20s and 40s AD. Most of his stuff was probably written before Christianity. And he attests, he attests to the fact that there was in Jewish angelology of the time, there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a certain archangel, whom he describes. And he says that the man named Jesus in the book of Zechariah, Zechariah 6, he claims that guy is this archangel. So in fact, he's identifying an archangel named Jesus who has all of these attributes. He's the firstborn son of God. He's the celestial image of God. He's God's agent of creation and God's celestial high priest. Now the curious thing here is these are all the attributes of the Jesus in the epistles. That's an extraordinarily unlikely coincidence. To have all of these very unusual attributes assigned to a Jesus in both Paul and Philo suggests there's some common element, that in fact the Jesus in the epistles is this archangel. He was taken from Jewish angelology, which means you don't need a historical Jesus to explain where the idea came from.
Very obviously, Carrier starts off with his conclusion, and then starts discussing how he came to that conclusion. And he very explicitly states that Philo mentions this figure as a pre-existent archangel. And aside from the Jesus part, This would be the academic consensus about Philo's archangel here. How exactly is this not dishonestly editing a video? I mean, if you cut out the entire section where Carrier is explaining his argument and why he comes to the conclusion that he does, then sure, you can make it seem like Carrier is just ad hoc claiming that Philo addresses this archangel figure as Jesus. That's not reality though, and it only gets worse in these clips.
We know from Philo of Alexandria, who's writing in the 20s, 30s AD, that he, this is one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the time, and he wrote about a particular angel in Jewish angelology, and he says that this particular angel is the same character named Jesus in this particular Old Testament passage in Zechariah that he points out. So here we have a passage in the Old Testament with a god name or an angel named Jesus, and Philo is saying that that's this particular angel. And this is what he says. He says this angel is the firstborn son of God. Does that sound familiar? He says he's the celestial image of God. He's God's agent of creation. In other words, God couldn't be bothered to actually do the creation. He actually sent this angel to go do it for him. And he's God's celestial high priest because, you know, everything on earth is all dirty and messy, and you got to have your own super amazing space alien temple. So you have the temple on earth is just a dim copy of the true space temple, and you have to have a true space priest for the space temple. And the interesting thing with this, though, is that this is exactly the Jesus that's in the epistles. All the exact same attributes, same guy.
Notice how in this one, Neal leaves in the part where Carrier explains that the name Jesus actually comes from Zechariah, which Philo is citing. Neal notices it too and even points it out. Yet, the very first video in this clip package has Carrier explicitly stating that Zechariah is where Jesus' name comes from.
He actually finds the character named Jesus in Zechariah 6, and he says that this being actually is a celestial being, not a man in history, unlike the verse as it was originally intended.
So Neal had to have heard that Carrier used Zechariah to get the name Jesus, and he made the conscious decision to cut that out. He also cut it out from the third video. Of course, the second video in this clip package didn't contain the very detailed information that the other videos do, so Neal didn't have to clip anything out of that one. The fourth video, Neal cuts out Carrier making a distinction between his conclusion and what Philo says.
Philo of Alexandria, and he's alive at the same time as Paul, same time as Jesus. Philo of Alexandria is a Jewish scholar in Alexandria, Egypt. And he tells us this: if you want the sources, not the impossible faith, we'll give them to you with quotations and everything. He tells us that there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. And you know who this celestial Jesus was? He was the firstborn son of God. Philo says this point blank. He's the image of God. He's God's agent of creation, and he's God's celestial high priest, because God had a temple in heaven as well as the earthly temple. And the heavenly temple needed a priest too, and that's this guy. He was also called the Logos. All these things Philo tells us. Now, it's worth pointing out that all of these things are Christian beliefs attested in the letters of Paul. So what are the odds that Paul is talking to Christians and Christians are talking to Paul about a God who exactly fits this archangel that Philo is talking about, that Jews already believed in, who is not a historical person but a celestial being? I think it's extremely unlikely.
And the sixth video in this clip package is just the video from earlier where he claimed to be speaking verbatim from what Carrier was saying, but he wasn't. And that's another thing. He claims that that particular video, that sixth video, is actually the eighth video. So apparently there's two more videos out there where Carrier has supposedly done the same thing. So, I mean, I don't know if he's cut things out of those two, but given what we've seen in this 1/6 clip package, I can only assume that he dishonestly edited those too. So yes, Neal has cut critical information out of the clips that he put together in order to misrepresent what Carrier was arguing for. The video that Neal showed to Carrier during their conversation had cut out all context and skipped to the conclusion that Carrier made. And that's why he had Carrier thinking that he had misworded something in his lecture.
And this is the reason why people don't take Carrier seriously. It's not that he's questioning the sources on how Jesus is, there's no sources that he didn't write anything down. It's not that there's no contemporary people that are like, hey, I live next to Jesus. We don't have any physical evidence of Jesus. That's not what people are criticizing Carrier for. It's the fact that he's pushing this narrative that there's a pre-existing Jesus tradition that predates Christianity. That's nonsense. If anyone's going to debate him, you just go focus right on that because he has no answer for that. There's no evidence for it.
This is false. We've already seen Carrier directly addressing this argument with Neal.
I think you're missing. God, this
okay,
is
so what
now.
you're saying, hold on, let me clarify this. What you're saying is you never actually say that Philo says the angel's name is Jesus, but Philo's talking about an angel and that angel is named Jesus.
Correct. And there's a
okay,
reason,
fine, fair enough.
There's a reason why I say it that way.
But don't you think people might take that, hear this the wrong way still?
And from what we saw earlier, Neal seemed to be incoherently arguing some aspect of this Philo argument that made no sense to either Carrier, myself, or other people that I know. The main problem that Neal seems to have is that he's not recognizing that Philo was using Pesher logic in order to get his information about his Logos archangel. Neal has to use the original context of the Zechariah passage and somehow weirdly connect it to numbers in order for his argument to make sense to him or only him. I'm not sure who's convinced by Neal's argument, but it's very obviously incoherent. Neal only had ad hoc reasons to reject the idea that Philo was even creating Pesherim in this section. I mean, he can't seriously sit there and claim that there's no evidence for it when he spent over 20 minutes directly with Carrier stepping through the argument.
He'll point to a text that's in the late 90s, Ascension of Isaiah. And then you'll say, but wait a minute, you're the one saying we can't use the Gospels as evidence because they're so late. Why are we using the Ascension of Isaiah? Some people say it's in the 2nd century. Some people, a lot of scholars think essentially it's 2nd century text. Why are we using you're just going to cherry pick the sources that you think are good and then deny the ones that you think are bad and call them late? That's a double standard right there. You can't do that. So that's one of the things that I would be mainly focused on if I was going to debate. Like, Carrie, where's your angelic Jesus at? It doesn't exist. Just admit that.
I don't even know what in the fuck he's talking about here. Carrier uses the Ascension of Isaiah as a later example of Christians developing a similar idea to this descending and ascending Christ figure. He doesn't use the Ascension of Isaiah to prove anything about Philo or Philo's angel. And the earliest redaction that we can construct of the Ascension of Isaiah doesn't have the pocket gospel. And that's what the existing scholarship says. But the case that Carrier makes about the pocket gospel not being in the Ascension of Isaiah, at least the earliest redaction of it, is pretty ironclad. It's hard to argue against it.
So did he make a response article to your video showing that his... What did he say? What was his argument?
I'm the PhD expert. He's not. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm an expert. I have a PhD. I have an expert. And mic drop. He puts mic drop at the end of his own article. Like, who does that? Who puts mic drop at the end of their own blogs?
Considering how verbose and specific Carrier is in his blog posts, I was initially skeptical of this claim. Not only did I find that Carrier said a whole hell of a lot more in his blog posts about Neal, but lo and behold, there is no mic drop whatsoever in the article. He has used mic drop when he discussed Mike Lacona's failings on a particular topic, but he doesn't use that in the context of Neal, Gnostic informant, and this Philo angel thing. In fact, if you do a Google search for Dr. Carrier's website, you will see that the only time that mic drop is ever mentioned, it's not by Carrier, but by a commenter. And this commenter was actually quoting Dr. Kip Davis, who was actually quoting Neal and then says, Neal at Gnostic Informant is not a raging egomaniac like Richard Carrier, so he won't say this, but I think it needs to be said here. Mic drop. Of course, this was in reference to Neal actually making the statement that it's actually Dr. Carrier's fault if Neal doesn't understand the mythicism argument. which kind of seems a bit weird. So it kind of seems like Neal is either lying or he just heard it from somebody who was lying to him, and he didn't bother to fact check it. Of course, Neal or whoever was constructing this lie was meaning it to make Carrier look childish or make him look bad. But honestly, when you find out that he didn't do that and doesn't do that, it has the exact opposite effect Neal was hoping for.
And it was just kind of like, I think one of the things that he might be, let's be honest here, one of the things that he might have, that I might have been wrong about was the Nazareth thing. There is a couple academics that think that Pliny the Elder's Tetrarch of the Nazarini is referring to Nazareth, but that's not a consensus thing. I kind of said it like it was. He got me on that part. I admit that. The rest of the video, I don't think he has any answer for it at all.
I'm sorry, but my entire video responding to Neal was only ever using On the Historicity of Jesus to respond to Neal. And not to mention that Carrier directly mentions my video to Neal.
To be honest with you, though, although I didn't see Godless Engineer's video, I did see a draft of the script for it, and I'm pretty sure he's spot on in most of that. So I don't know
which video are you talking about?
Video. The one where he goes into the Philo stuff. He might have gone into other things too, but
no, I think that was a complete flop, in my opinion.
Okay,
we can get into that.
Yeah, right. So that's actually the other example I'd like to talk about. But
so as we can already tell in this extremely long video, Carrier has a lot to say in response to Neal. So I really don't know what in the fuck he's talking about here.
And that's another thing. It's like the Nazareth thing has nothing to do with his theory anyway. That was like a 0.1% of my video, like compared to like the grand scheme of me like really focusing on, dude, your theories about an angel named Jesus that existed before Christianity, which is not a thing at all. Nobody thinks that. Not one person, except for your predecessor, Earl Doherty, who's not an expert. He's just a guy who wrote a book.
Yeah, but Neal was wildly wrong about the argument, and he's the one that even brought it up. If it didn't matter, then why did he bring it up? It's such a mindfuck, because at this point, Neal has brought up the whole Nazareth thing, and then when I criticize him about it, he's acting like it just simply doesn't matter. So why the fuck am I even mentioning it? What this does is it makes him look disorganized to the point that he seems to just be throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks.
So he said one of the main arguments he has is that there is this pre-existing tradition of Jesus. Is that the crux of his position? Is that the main justification for why he believes Jesus didn't exist?
Yeah.
This is the most ignorant answer that Neal could give, considering this.
Let me ask you this. Let's assume that, for the sake of argument, let's assume that you're right. Philo thought it was Jesus. Never says it though. Never makes any message of it.
Yeah, he just cites the verse.
How do you use this again to prove mythicism against Christianity? Are you saying that?
I literally don't. So
then what?
This is in my section on background knowledge. I make very clear at the beginning of that section, which is actually in chapter 4, which begins the 2 chapters, I should say, on background knowledge, and there are 48 numbered elements. And in the beginning, I explain that the background knowledge does not tell the difference to us between whether Jesus existed or not, because every single 48 item thing in there is compatible with a historical Jesus, right? So even if you agreed with me that Philo is talking about a Jesus who had all these angelic properties, that is in no way an argument for historists or for mythicism, because Christians could just simply believe that Jesus was their Jesus was an incarnation of this Jesus, right? Exactly. In fact, they could totally have renamed him Jesus for this purpose. Like we don't have to assume that Jesus was his given name. He might have been walking around being called Emmanuel or whatever. Like his actual name could have been anything. Or he might have said, I'm going to call myself the Jesus now so that it lines up. And I actually make an argument for this.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
So basically, Neal is calling Carrier a liar after Carrier has written around 700 pages, where he argues for the ahistoricity of Jesus. He builds a substantial case making that argument. He spent around 5 years researching this topic specifically. And this is a case where Philo is in the background knowledge and in no way affects his conclusion. Now, on the other hand, we have Neal, who in this video alone we have shown has said things that are false and that he should know are false because he has been told directly to his face that they are false. He still says them though, so calling Neal a liar is just an accurate description.
When we look at if there's a person, look at historicity, it's not about if he's mythologized or not. Obviously Jesus is mythologized and legendized. That's not what anyone's debate. It's about like there's certain things that indicate that there probably was a guy who got crucified. And so there, at this point in time, we don't, the data suggests that there probably was something that happened. That's it. And so to come along and say that, oh, we have evidence of a pre-existing tradition in Judaism where there's where they worshipped a logos named Jesus, you have to show evidence for that. You can't just say that. You have to. That's really fringe. There's a reason why people don't take him seriously. That's like aliens type shit. That's like the aliens met the president type shit. That's nonsense. It really is. There's no evidence at all for it.
As we've seen in this video, at no point has the argument ever said that anybody worshipped this pre-existent angel figure. And the only part that Neal has a problem with is attributing the name Jesus to this logos figure. But that is part of the argument that Carrier actually makes. Neal obstinately wants to interpret Zechariah 6:12 in its original context when Philo is obviously not reading it in that way. Philo is literally saying that it makes no sense to call a human person Anatole. But if you reinterpret the passage to be talking about his own incorporeal being known as the Logos, the firstborn son of God, his celestial high priest, then it makes all the sense. Neal requires you to forego what Philo is literally saying in order for his argument to even be coherent. He claims that you need to provide evidence for Carrier's argument, which is true, you do, but he totally forgoes the pure fact of reality that Carrier has provided that evidence. Yet he still stubbornly claims that Carrier has no evidence. I feel like that's a definition of a lie. It's a mindfuck for sure, and it's a mindfuck because we literally sat here and we watched Carrier baby step Neal through the argument. As for the aliens meeting the president thing that Neal claims here, this is actually not the weirdest thing that Philo would believe. Dr. Bart Ehrman illuminates an even weirder idea that sounds oddly familiar.
At times, Philo goes even further and imagines Moses as a kind of pre-existent divine being sent to earth for a time. Quote, "And even when God sent him as alone to the earthly sphere and caused him to dwell there, he fitted him with no ordinary excellence, such as that which kings and rulers have, but he appointed him as God, placing all the bodily region and the mind which rules it in subjection and slavery to him." End quote. Sacrifices 8-10. Dr. Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God.
So Ehrman shows that Philo considered Moses to be a pre-existent divine figure that was given a loner body and sent down from heaven. I wonder if Philo thinks that Moses ascended back up into heaven after his death. Spoiler alert, he does.
Like other specifically favored humans who had a particularly close relationship with God, so close that Moses himself could be considered in some sense divine, at the end of his life, Moses was highly exalted by God and made immortal. Quote, "When he was about to depart from hence to heaven, to take up his abode there, and leaving this mortal life to become immortal, having been summoned by the Father, who now changed him, having previously been a double being composed of soul and body, into the nature of a single body, transforming him wholly and entirely into a most son-like mind." End quote. Life of Moses 2:28. Dr. Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God.
Well, shit, it looks like he does. Now, What does that sound like? An incorporeal being that is given a body and sent from heaven to be king or ruler over something. And then once they're dead, they are exalted and ascend back up into heaven to become immortal. Shit, this sounds pretty familiar to me. What does it sound like?
Jesus!
You're right, honey. Specifically, the minimal mythicist version of Jesus.
So you had this like graph of all the different people that he has these tropes or whatever that Jesus qualifies as these tropes, and he says that one of the reasons he thinks Jesus is a myth because it fits these like archetypes of stories or whatever. And then you show that there's a list of a whole bunch of historical figures that also qualify on the vast majority of those criterions that he had.
You see, this is the problem that I have with people that don't read the material and obstinately refuse to read the material, because if T-Money had actually read the material, then he would know that this again is just something in the background information of the argument. It's not the argument. It's in the background of it. The shit you consider before you even start considering the evidence. He uses it to establish a reference class for Jesus. And in this reference class, Dr. Carrier isn't saying that everybody that matches this particular criteria is 100% fictional. Dr. Carrier actually allows up to 1/3 of the individuals that rank high on the Rank-Raglan mythotype to be real historical people. I think that if somebody ranks high on the Rank-Raglan mythotype, that's most likely going to indicate that they're not real historical people. But that does not mean that everybody that does rank high is a fictional person. And Carrier accounts for that because he has two conclusions that he comes to. One is an a fortiori conclusion, which pretty much gives the historicity side as much leeway as can be reasonably given. And then there's the more conservative or the more mythicist conclusion that has a far smaller probability of Jesus existing in history. And I want y'all to notice something. Carrier's conclusion, after reviewing all of the evidence, comes to about a 1/3 probability that Jesus actually existed in history. I know what you're thinking. This matches the 1/3 probability of matching high on the Rank-Raglan mythotype, and that 1/3 are historical people. And you might be curious, like, well, it kind of seems like he says Rank-Raglan says he's fictional, therefore he's most likely fictional. But that's not actually what the argument does. What the argument does is it starts off with the reference class being a 1/3 probability of Jesus existing. Then, after reviewing the evidence, we find that the evidence does not significantly move that needle at all. So Jesus seems to match the Rank-Raglan mythotype because he is in the other 2/3 of that, being that they are not historical people, they are fictional people. But it's just categorically wrong to say that Carrier's argument is that he fits this particular criteria, therefore he's not historical. For whatever reason, people seem to not want to read the goddamn scholarship on this. And it's not even that you've got to read the entire thing. If you have a certain argument that you have a problem with, just read that section. That's all you got to do. And if anything, it's to shore up your arguments against it. You can only benefit from actually reading the scholarship. Because what's the point if you're just arguing against some kind of straw man you just made up? Well, this has been a thoroughly long video cataloging all of the misrepresentations and, dare I say it, outright lies by Neal. I'm sincerely hoping that this is the last that I have to ever address this, but I feel like it's important to correct the misinformation when it pops up. That's always been my intent with this channel, is to find misrepresentations of scholarship or misrepresentations of arguments or misrepresentations of reality and provide good information to override that misinformation. And so I will continue to do that. I just hope now people can see the information laid out completely and they can know that the argument, as far as Philo goes, is not that Jews were worshiping some pre-existent archangel named Jesus that was the Messiah. That's a bastardization of the argument, and it's simply not what is being said. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. If you will, please let me know what you thought about this entire analysis down below in the comments. I'd really love to hear y'all's ideas on it. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.